If you would stand with me and turn to the book of Mark. Chapter 16. And we're going to start at verse 4. But when they looked up, they saw that the stone had been rolled away, for it was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man clothed in a long white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him? But go, tell his disciples," what's next? "And Peter, that he is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him as he sent you." So they went out quickly and fled from the tomb, for they trembled and were amazed. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Now the part I want you to take notice is, tell his disciples and Peter. I want you all to turn to your neighbor and say, I can still get there from here. My dad's from Kentucky, and he had a very Kentucky sense of humor. And I'd ask him, "Dad, how do you get to such and such place?" And he would say, "You can't get there from here. You got to go this way and then over here into this town, and then once you get to that town, then you can get there." Thanks, Dad. You're a big help. And as I was thinking about that memory came to mind, and I was thinking, how many times have we encountered places in our life in which we thought that by now we'd be someplace else? I know that Chuck is, or has been, for the most part, a bivocational minister. He's worked as an EMT. He's worked in a funeral home. He's sold vacuum sweepers for a while. He's worked at Osborne Associates. He's worked at several different places, and even now he has a job on the side that he does. He's a very bivocational minister for a purpose, because we have always felt that this church needed us, and we had to go the extra mile to make that work. There are things that we went through outside of the confines of the church that God has used to teach us, to make us better ministers to folks so that we can relate more. We go to Kroger like everybody else goes to Kroger. We go to Walmart like everybody else goes to Walmart. We can relate to folk who struggle to put 2 pennies together and pay a bill. We punch a time clock. Chuck still does, he does it all. He does these things on the side so that he can still visit the sick, and he can still run a vacation Bible school, and he can still do weddings, and he can still do funerals. He can still pastorally counsel. He can still help with cleaning the church. This is called life, and we all do it to the best that we can so that we can get there. Can you say it again? I can still get there. I have a business, a counseling business, but I still have a ministry. And God often takes those gifts and those talents that He's planted in you to bring about a blessing for the church. You know, Chuck, he went to Tri-County. You know Tri-County? And, you know, he can do plumbing, and he can do electrical, and he can do carpentry, and he can do all these different things for himself, but he also does it for the church. God uses what he gives you. But I'm not a flawless person. I'm not ideal. If you're expecting me to be the perfect epitome of a pastor's wife, I'll just go ahead and apologize now. I'm that one where Chuck says, now we're going in, can you behave normally? I'll try, dear. Don't cross your fingers. There's a little bit of good in every bad person, and there's a little bit of bad in every good person. And for some of us, there's a lot of slightly less than in us. I pay my tithe, I give in my offering, I pray, and I make mistakes. We would like for our leaders to be ideal. We want them to be perfect, the perfect image of Christians. But let's face it, that's not a promise that I can give on this side of glory. But, let's say it again, I can still get there from here. Amen. We cannot and we should not judge a person based on one moment in time in their life. One scene we've had the privilege of witnessing. God has a plan. Wasn't it King David who said that he'd rather be judged by God than judged by men? For God only knows the big picture and what's inside of us and what we go through when we go through a bad season in our life. Have you noticed you can do 100 things right and one thing wrong, and that's what they focus on? Is that one instant in your life of weakness? We have peaks, we have valleys, we have ups, we have downs. It's called life. Life does what life does. And it slaps us around from one moment to the next, and then it rewards our perseverance after that. It can bring haters to your doorstep and malicious gossipers behind your back. And then it can bring the truth out. Say it again with me. I can still get there from here. My brother once said, if there was no promise of reward for doing good, and no risk of eternal retribution for doing bad, if you still chose to do good, then you're living authentically. But if you don't know Jesus and you're still doing good, what does it matter? It matters. It matters. The bad things in life are not always spiritual attacks or demonic warfare. It gives, it takes, it makes you laugh, it makes you cry, simply because sin is not just personal. You know, I can sin. That's a very personal thing. But the nation can sin. A community can sin. And that will be judged as well. We must live life in a sin-filled world, trying to do the best that we can. Such is the case with Peter. I find myself wondering, if I had been Jesus, would I have chosen Peter Now remember, back in those days, they didn't have the luxury of the Bible to see what was going to happen. They were living in that time. I'm thinking to myself, if I knew that I had a really big thing to do for God, and I only could pick 12 people, and I had 3 years to accomplish this mission. Are you hearing me? Would I have picked Peter? Even now, if I think we would have chosen differently back then, would we have the knowledge and the wisdom now? Peter was a lot of work. Jesus had to do a lot of inward work on Peter while he was doing outward work on the masses. I think about that sometimes in our life. He's expecting us to do various things for him, and he wants the masses to be ministered to, all while he's trying to do this inward work on us to get us to where we need to be. Can you say it again? I can still get there from here. Let's look at Peter. Peter was a business owner. He had a fishing business. He went out to fish one day, and Peter saw himself as a fisherman. This was his identity. He knew who he was. He was a fisherman. And then along comes Jesus and asks to borrow his boat. I don't know if I would have. Would you have said yes? This is a perfect stranger to you. A perfect stranger walks up to you and asks, "Can I borrow your car?" Now it's getting a little personal, isn't it? "Can I borrow your car?" You don't know him. But Peter was, he was gracious that way. He stopped what he was doing. He said, "All right. You're going to preach a sermon? You want my boat as a platform?" Remember I said that sometimes God uses the gifts and the talents and the resources that you have to accomplish what he wants done. And in Peter he was a fisherman, but he had a boat. I'm kind of thinking out loud here. Are you thinking with me? Boy, you guys were quiet. Was it the fireworks last night? But then Jesus comes along and he redefines Peter. He said, "I don't want you to be a fisherman. I want you to be a fisher of men." He redefines this calling by just slightly altering his course. And because he slightly alters his course, his whole destiny is changed. So many times God will take your history and he'll use it to build your destiny. I started preaching when I was 17 years old. Preached my first sermon in an AG church in Evansville, Indiana. Several hundred people, 17. My dad preached his very first sermon in that same church. Ironic, huh? And because of that, I pulled out a Bible that was the Bible that Dad had preached his first sermon out of. So I thought that was pretty cool. Unfortunately, the leather was falling out, so I kind of had to hold it just so, or the whole thing would fall apart while I was preaching. But God took me from that place to bring me here. When Dad would do like pastoral care counseling, he would often invite me in to sit in and be another person in the room, and then the Holy Spirit would speak to me and he would give me some sort of revelation on something, And Dad would let me speak up. And little did I know that God was training me from back then to do what he's asked me to do today. He had prophesied over me through a couple of ministers and said, you'll have a ministry that as of right now you know nothing about. And being an evangelist's daughter, a missionary's niece, a circuit preacher's granddaughter, an evangelist's daughter, a pastor's daughter, I kept thinking, what have I not seen? I felt like I've seen it all. And then he said, you'll have a ministry that as of right now you know nothing about. Okay, Lord, you're going to take whatever this is back here in my history and you're going to use it for me to be able to minister somehow in the future. And that's what he did with Peter. He used his history as a fisherman to bring about the ministry that Jesus needed at that time. He'll use the things that you've learned the hard way, and he'll use it to bring about purpose and fulfillment in your destiny. When Jesus went to him, he said, can I borrow your boat? I need to teach a lesson over here to the masses. Paraphrasing there, But we don't know what we would have said, but Peter said yes. Peter had a giving spirit, which may have been one of the reasons that Jesus chose him. God doesn't put us in our position for the sake of income and money, and if he wanted you to have a certain amount of money, he could give it to you. He could gift it to you. He could put it in the mouth of a fish. He could, rain it down from heaven. He can do, he can do what he needs to do. But he's positioned you in a job for a purpose. I can look out here and I know some of the occupations of many of you, and I can honestly say without a doubt that I can point at you and say, you are where you are for a reason. There's helping ministries and there's healing ministries, and you might be punching a time clock and going into a factory, but you are surrounded by people who need you and need to hear the gospel. In order for Peter to follow Jesus, he had to set aside his preconceived idea of what his calling was and trust a stranger. Trust a stranger with the purpose of his life. I'm certain that when he woke up that morning, he didn't say, I'm going to quit my thriving fishing business and I'm going to become an Uber driver for Christ. And I'm going to take Christ where he needs to go. And that will be my destiny. I don't think he said that. I'm almost certain he didn't say Uber. Just saying. But yet, because he chose that route, Peter got to walk on water because he got himself connected to Jesus. He got connected to Jesus's purpose. Satan doesn't want you connected to the right people because your blessings and your destiny purpose is connected to those people. If people walk out of your life, then your purpose is not connected to them. But the people that are presently in your world, they're there for a reason. Satan wants you to keep your eyes off of that fact. He wants you to go to your job, punch a time clock, come home, get your supper, go to bed. God forbid that you should reach out and touch someone and bring someone and fill the church. Your next is tied up in your connections. But on the wall back behind us, we are looking at all the different names of Christ, of God, and looking at how we are connected and what He's doing in our life, in our world. A meaningful connection. Peter became a part of the inner circle of Christ. He was hanging out with Christ. He was kicking it with the Messiah. Because he was willing to walk away from his preconceived idea of who he was and what he should be doing. Can you imagine what Peter's father would have said? Wait a minute, I helped you with that business. I set you up in that business. I paid for your college degree. I don't know. I taught you how to fish, and you're just going to walk away and what? Drive a Messiah around so that he can minister? And the fact that he would have never seen the woman with the issue of blood be healed. He would have never seen blind Bartimaeus healed. He would have never walked on water had he not taken his preconceived ideas and set it over here and listened to God's direction and pulled himself along with God and connected himself. I've often said that the evidence of our vertical connection is played out in our horizontal connections. How we touch other lives indicates that we've got a vertical connection worth emulating. I mean, I don't want to diss Peter, but he wasn't college educated. He was just your average guy working a job, making ends meet, putting food on the table. He wasn't what we would have referred to as an intellectual. He didn't have clout in the community. He didn't have pull. So Jesus obviously didn't call him because he was somebody. But there was something about Peter that made Jesus choose him. There is something that God places within us, each of us, that transcends our backgrounds and our intellect. Even if you have intellect, you still need that something that God places in us, whatever that might be. I don't even know what to call it. It's just a something that God puts in you that makes you desire to reach out and touch another life in a positive way and affect a positive change. Well, we do know that Peter was a man of action. I mean, he was the one that said, "If that's you, bid me to come." Would you have said that? I don't know. Would you have stepped out on that water? And if you remember, he was the one, when he came off the mountain, he said, "Oh, let's build a temple for Abraham, and let's build a temple for Moses, and let's build one for you." And Jesus was like, "Calm down. Dial it back." He was a man of action. He pulled out his sword, cut off an ear. When I think about that, I have to think he was aiming high. That ear probably was not his target. He was a man of action. I'm wondering if that might be part of why he was a part of the 12. Perhaps we need more Peters in the church. Ones that step out with an audacity to walk on water. Maybe we need someone to be more courageous and pull out a sword when the time comes. A spiritual sword. Not really me. I want you to... Don't put that on the nightly news. That's not good. And another aspect of Peter that I find interesting is in Matthew chapter 16 and verses 13 through 17, is that telling of when Jesus looks at his disciples and says, "Who do the people say that I am?" And the disciples said, "Well, some say that you're Elijah. Some say that you're John the Baptist. Some say that you're Abraham. Some say you're some other prophet." And then Jesus turns around and says, "But who do you say that I am?" And who spoke up? Peter. Peter. And Peter said, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." He didn't say, "Some say you are the Messiah." He made a declaration. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Now, here's the interesting thing. When you look back at his journey up until that point, God opened up the clouds and said, "This is my Son in whom I am well pleased." But he never said, "This is the Messiah." In another translation, it says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And that term was not used. Christ is not Jesus' last name, okay? Let's just get that straight. Although there's probably some people out there that think that is. It is not. Christ is another word for Messiah. So when Peter made this declaration, Jesus was a little taken back because he said, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood." Meaning, I haven't told you that. You didn't hear that from me. "But by my Father in heaven." And then he goes on to say, "And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." And I thought about that, and I was like, on this rock, on this rock. We know that Peter is another word for rock in that day, but I'm thinking to myself, on this rock, here's Peter getting a revelation of who Christ is to him, and that connection. And on this rock, this revelation, I will build my church. And the gates of hell shall not overcome it. If we don't watch it, we'll be real loud on the gossip and real quiet on the revelation. You remember the disciples said, "Well, some say this and some say that." Everybody has an opinion based on hearsay, but what does the Spirit say? And what is the Spirit teaching you? Because out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. And if we're listening to gossip after gossip after gossip, what is going to come out? Gossip. And if we want the church to be built, we're going to have to build it on the rock of knowing that revelation of who Christ is in relation to us. So basically that comes two different directions. What are you saying and what are you hearing? Have you ever been with a friend and they tell you what someone else has said about you? And that kind of lets you know they didn't say anything. Yeah, they weren't the one to dispute what was being said. So we have to watch who it is that we are connected to. We've got these connections, that's that vertical connection, but who it is that we're connected to, who are we reaching out to, and on what level? I can reach out to you and you can minister to me in that level, but when it comes time for us to reach out to someone who's unsaved, we have to have boundaries. Because we don't want them influencing us, we want to influence them. And it was just 1 out of 12 that spoke up and spoke the truth. How could all 12 of them walk with Christ for that long, seeing all those miracles, miracle after miracle, and lives being touched, delivered, healed, set free, and still question the veracity of the calling on Christ's life and the quality of Christ's character? I'd like to think that you are all quiet because you're just thinking. How could you see my love in action and still listen to the gossipers about me? How can you go to a Bible-believing church and still live biblically unsound lives? How can you not know whose I am and still claim to know who I am? How can you be exposed to deliverance but never be delivered? I can imagine the exasperation in Christ's heart until Peter spoke up. Those 11 saying, well, so-and-so says you're this, and so-and-so says you're that, and he's probably going, really? But who do you say? I want to hear what you say. There was no shyness. There was no wavering of faith, no insecurity. Thou art Christ, the Son of the living God. He was clear about who he was following. Say it again. I can still get there from here. Amen, brother. Are you clear about who you're following? Or do you just come to church to come to church? It's something to do on a Sunday morning. It's an hour and a half long. It makes me feel like I've done something worthwhile. But who are you following once you leave the church? He was taught Son of God, yeah, but not Christ. This is revelation knowledge. Peter, the man of action, had gone deeper, somehow deeper than the others. And there were few in the disciples that were educated. Jesus had not yet come to the cross. Not at that point. You know you're there. You know you're there when you can shock Jesus in a positive way. I like the thought of that. Upon this rock of revelation, this rock of people who can hear from God, this rock of people who can perceive the imperceivable, this rock of people who have been touched by the Father with divine knowledge, I will build my church on this rock. On the backs of men who have heard from God and know through divine intervention who they are in connection with, the Son of the living God. That is spiritual freedom. When you know that you know that you know. Peter followed Jesus from mountaintop to mountaintop, from transfiguration to crucifixion. The good, the bad, the ugly. We're taking it all in because it's called life. Who do you say that I am? I find that an interesting statement. Who do you say that I am? In other words, when someone comes up to you and they're talking to you about your belief system, they're really saying, who is Christ to you? Not who is he to the church, but who is he to you on a personal level? What is your relationship with him on a personal level? In Luke chapter 22, verses 31 through 33, Jesus spoke with Peter, and Jesus says to him, Satan hath desired to have you, that he may sift you as wheat. What's that next statement? But I have prayed for you. If you want someone praying for you, if you want someone interceding for you, it's Christ, right? Oh, my word. And he said unto him, or he says, but I have prayed for thee, that thy faith fail not. And when thou art converted, strengthen thy brethren. Now, this is after the Passover. So Jesus was sitting around the table with all his board members, the board of directors, and he looks at them and he says, one of you is going to betray me. One of you is going to betray me. And here's the interesting thing. All of them looked around and said, is it I? Is it I? Am I going to be the one? So in my mind, using, Psych 101 skills here, it means that there was friction. There was cause for them to ask, is it I? It wasn't a perfect, ideal world, just like today is not a perfect, ideal world. You look around this room, and if we wanted to get really good, bad, and ugly, we could point at people and say, this is your fault. This is your flaw. This is your moral failure. Is it I? Is it I? And then Jesus kind of lets them off the hook and says, it's the one that dips with me. And then you can almost feel like Peter's probably, whew, he's not talking about me. He's not talking about me. Oh, what a relief. Well, I know it's not me. One of you is working for the devil's interests. One of you is doing the devil's work. That sounds that's pretty intense, isn't it? I mean, could you imagine if Christ walked in here and said, right now, in this congregation, one of you is working for the interests of the enemy? And you'd be going, take a step back. You might even be tempted to say, is it me? Is it me? Because we have conflict. Is it me? But we have not crossed over into that wickedness that Judas crossed over into. Now, I'm not dissing on Judas. I'm just making a fact. Not me. Not me. It's right after Jesus says this, Satan has desired to have you. He wants to break you into pieces and throw you into the wind. Sift you like wheat. Break you into pieces, throw you into the wind, and the chaff blows away. That's not the kind of prophecy you give and expect really big offerings. But I have prayed for you, not that you wouldn't fail, but that your faith wouldn't fail. Not that you wouldn't go through stuff, but that your faith wouldn't fail when you are going through stuff. No use in having faith if you don't go through stuff, right? So that, in the book of Job it says, so that you shall come out as pure gold. We go through these things. We're tried and we're tested like Peter was over and over and again. Was Peter perfect? No, Peter was not perfect. And I'm kind of thinking, the first verse we read, tell the disciples and Peter that it was because of some of the things that happened. And Peter probably was stepping back saying, I failed. I was one of the 12. I was the in crowd. I was doing the bidding of the Father. And I messed it up. It's easy to live it in church. But if your faith doesn't make you different in your private life, if your faith doesn't affect how you do business, if your faith doesn't affect your character, if your faith doesn't make you apologize sometimes, if your faith doesn't convict you in your private life, then I'm not going to give you tuppence for your faith. How you run all over the church and hoop and holler, how you clap your hands loud, how you give in the offering, how you sit in your little assigned spot from week to week, doesn't matter if the transformation isn't there. And then Peter is confronted. And a man says to him, Aren't you part of that gang? Aren't you one of them? Could have swore I saw you hanging out, when they fed those 5,000. Weren't you one of those with the basket? And he steps back and he's saying, well, it was kind of like this. I don't really know him. I just kind of know of him. I'm not connected with him. I'm not a part of that. How many times? 3 times. 3 times. In my mind, in the 50-some years that I have been in existence, I can think of nothing more hurtful, more devastating to a human being than to deny a connection. Have you ever seen a father that says, you're not my son anymore? What does that do to the son? Or when a father has several sons and he acknowledges 1 or 2, but doesn't acknowledge this one over here. Or when a husband and a wife go into let's say a Christmas party at work, and the husband does not acknowledge her as his wife. How does that feel? That's almost what I consider wicked. The epitome of a relationship lies in the acknowledgement of that relationship. If Nathan were to give Chelsea a dozen roses at home, and she'll look at those roses and she'll say, oh, then that's sweet. I'll just put these in water and I'll put those over here, and then she'll go about her day. But if Nathan gets a dozen roses and has them delivered to her place of employment, and this delivery guy walks in with this big bouquet of roses and there's a card on it, and the tellers at work stop what they're doing and they look at those roses and they're thinking inside, who's that for? Who does that belong to? And then that delivery guy walks over to the desk and sits it in front of Chelsea. Don't you tell me she won't go home to him and give him a different response. Because she has been acknowledged in public for the connection that she had. And what did Peter do? He denied that connection. And when he did it 3 times and the cock crowed, what did he do? He wept. He wept bitterly because he knew. He knew. Are you hearing me? Moral failure, which was kind of what Judas was doing. Judas was more like a moral failure on his part. That's a sign of inward weakness. But when you don't acknowledge that connection, if you walked into that group of people and your spouse didn't acknowledge you as being the spouse, what kind of hurt would that cause in you? Jesus said, if you deny me on earth, I'll deny you in heaven. That is how important acknowledging that connection is. So when the Lord was hanging on that cross, crucified, virtually naked, bloodied, bruised, moaning in pain? Is this your so-called Messiah? And Peter says, I don't know him. I don't have a connection. But if you remember, Jesus said, you'll deny me 3 times. And what did Peter say? No, Lord, no, not me. Surely not me. I would never do that. But how many of us have done things we said we never would? I kind of feel for Peter. I mean, there's a part of me that understands the psychology of it, and I understand that he had to have been terrified because crucifixion was a thing of the day. It was a very real threat. I mean, nowadays, if somebody walks up to you and says, I'm going to crucify you, you might doubt them. But back then, and yet, everybody in here, bar none, has sinned. Me included. I'm not going to sit up here and say I'm picture perfect pastor's wife. No, not going to happen. Lightning will strike or something. But when people know your very personal sin, I look around and I think, I don't really know your sins. But when someone knows your personal sin, they kind of treat you different. And they kind of hold it up to your face. Or they'll come up to you and they'll say, hi, Sister Shelby. Nice seeing you again. And you get that little pity look. It's very nice of you to come. We've been praying for you. I mean, Peter was in denial. He was in denial prior. But you and I know that he's coming back. Jesus is coming back. When I had an internship in Vinton, Ohio, little town, little dot on the map, if you blink, you'd pass through it. And I'd set my GPS to get me there because it was over the meadow and through the woods and over the hills and past the Amish buggy and go down and it took me about an hour to get there. And then when I was there, I decided I want to take a lunch break, but I didn't know the surroundings. I didn't know where things were. So I go on my GPS and I say, I'd like to, restaurants. Restaurants pull up. I pick one out because GPS said it was close by, relatively close to Vinton. And I take off, and when the GPS said, you have arrived, there was no restaurant. There was a construction mess. The restaurant had been bulldozered. And I'm on a time limit. I got to get back to work. I have a certain amount of time to get my lunch, and I got to get back. And I'm telling the GPS, you're wrong, and it's not listening to me. And so I pick someplace else, and it's doing that little. Sometimes I feel like Peter spent a lot of time in this recalculating. Jesus had him on a road, he had him on a path, and he was sending him in a certain direction, and Peter, with weakness of moral character, with fear, with trembling, he steps off that path, and somewhere in the heavens, there's a recalculating going on, because God does not leave you there. And when the GPS gets done with its calculating, it tells you how to get to where you need to be from where you are. Not from where you were, from where you are. So when Dad said you can't get there from here, he was mistaken. And sometimes I feel like God is taking time to reroute some of us in here. There might have been times when maybe hidden in your heart there was some bitterness. Maybe there's some time when hidden in your heart was some ugliness, some denials, some hate, unrepented sin, coldness, or worse yet, lukewarmness, if I can say that word, unforgiveness. All of those things can take us off the route, where this little voice will come in your head and say, oh, you're no longer on the path. We need to recalculate. We need to reroute, because you can still get there from here. You can still get to where God wants you to be from here.